Hey, welcome back to the channel. Before we begin, I've got a quick question for you. What would you do if you found yourself alone on a long deserted highway at night, with nothing but the hum of your car and the darkness around you? Would you keep driving? Or would you pull over? Make sure you're wearing headphones for this one. The details, the tension, they're all in the sound. And if you enjoy the story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and share your own road trip horror stories in the comments. Let's get into it. It started as most road trips do, with excitement. We had no idea what was coming. My best friend Tim and I had just wrapped up a 3-day music festival in Austin, Texas. The plan was to take a scenic route home, stretching out the freedom just a little longer. We weren't in any rush to... We were young, reckless, and the open road was an escape from everything waiting for us back in the real world. What could go wrong, right? Well, have you ever heard of Highway 87? It's one of those Texas highways that feels like it's always night, even in broad daylight. The further you go, the less civilization you see. Towns become dots. Gas stations start feeling like relics. And you can't help but notice the miles between you and, well, anything. That was our route, hours and hours of flat land and dust. Around 8 p.m., we passed through this small, forgotten town called Eden. The irony wasn't lost on me. The place was anything but paradise. Just a couple of run-down buildings, a gas station that looked like it hadn't seen life in years, and one flickering streetlight. Tim, always the optimist, suggested we stop, but something about Eden didn't sit right with me. Have you ever been to a town that just gave you a bad feeling? One of those places you can't explain, but you know you shouldn't linger in? Let me know in the comments what you did. Did you stop, or did you keep driving like I did? As the sky bled from a dull orange to pitch black, the road seemed to stretch into eternity. Every few miles we'd see the reflection of an animal's eyes in the distance, but nothing else. No cars, no people, just us. Then it happened. About an hour past Eden, we saw him, a figure standing on the shoulder of the road. Did he thumb out hitchhiking? I could tell by Tim's look that he was thinking of stopping. We should help him, Tim said, already slowing the car. Are you crazy? There's nothing out here for miles. What if he's dangerous? But Tim, always the good guy, didn't listen. He pulled over a few feet ahead of the man. I felt this sudden weight in my chest, like the air had been sucked out of the car. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man running towards us, but he wasn't. He was just standing there, not moving. Tim rolled down the window. Hey man, you need a ride? The figure didn't respond. He just stood there, his head slightly tilted as if he was trying to figure us out. Tim looked at me, his face tense. I'm going to ask him again. But before Tim could open his mouth, the man moved. Not towards us, he just turned, walked back into the darkness and vanished into the desert. We sat there for a moment, both of us frozen. Then Tim hit the gas, and we sped off, leaving that strange figure behind. Have you ever had an encounter with a hitchhiker, or something strange on the side of the road? Drop a comment below and tell me about it. What would you have done? We should have turned around. We should have gone back the way we came. But the highway felt endless, and the last thing we wanted was to break down in the middle of nowhere. It was just after midnight when things got really weird. I was in the passenger seat, struggling to keep my eyes open, when I noticed the dashboard clock was stuck at 12:07. No matter how long we drove, it didn't change. "Hey, Tim," I said, my voice shaky. "What time is it on your phone?" Tim pulled out his phone, frowning as he looked at the screen. "It's dead." It was at 50% an hour ago. I pulled out mine. Dead too. The highway felt more isolated than ever. No signs, no landmarks. Just the black void of the desert stretching out in every direction. And then I noticed something else. We were running low on gas. Quick question. Do you check your gas before a road trip, or are you like me and assume you'll find a station when you need one? Well, this was one of those times I wished we had topped off in Eden. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had a close call like this. There was no choice but to pull over. Tim parked the car on the shoulder and we sat in the darkness, the wind howling outside. It was so quiet. No cars, no signs of life. "I'm going to check the map," Tim said, reaching for the glove box. I leaned my head against the window, trying to calm the rising panic in my chest. That's when I saw it. A light. In the distance, something flickered. At first I thought it might be headlights, but as it got closer, I realized it wasn't. The light was moving strangely, swaying back and forth like it was being carried. And then I saw them, figures, several of them, walking in a line like they were marching through the desert straight towards us. "Tim," I whispered, not daring to take my eyes off them. He didn't respond. He was staring ahead, frozen. The figures were getting closer. I could see them clearly now, 3 people, all holding lanterns, their faces obscured by hoods. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if they had all the time in the world, and they were heading straight for us. "We need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But the car wouldn't start. Tim was frantically turning the key in the ignition, but the engine just sputtered and died. The figures were only a few yards away now. I could make out their faces, expressionless, pale, like they were carved from stone. They were close enough that I could hear the faint hiss of their lanterns. Then one of them raised their hand and pointed directly at us. The air inside the car grew thick, like we were drowning in it. I tried to move, to speak, but I was frozen in place. I don't know how long we sat there, trapped in the car, as the figures circled us, and minutes, hours, time had stopped making sense. Finally, the figures turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving us alone again on that endless stretch of highway. But the damage was done. We never spoke about what we saw, but I know we both felt it, that deep, gnawing fear that something had followed us, something we couldn't shake. We eventually got the car started and made it to the next town, but the road never felt safe again. I thought, so what would you have done? Would you have stopped like we did or kept driving? Let me know in the comments. And if you found this story chilling, hit that like button, because the next one is going to be even scarier. Thank you for listening to the story. Have you ever had a strange road trip experience? A night when the road stretched too long or something unexplainable happened? Drop your own stories in the comments. And don't forget, next time, the story will be even more terrifying. It's funny how the road seems to stretch forever, but it can take you from one nightmare to another in the blink of an eye. It was supposed to be a quick stop. After what happened on Highway 87, I was desperate to get off the road. Tim and I were both on edge, our nerves shot, but we couldn't keep driving forever. We were still hours away from any major city, and that encounter with the strange figures had left us rattled. We needed rest, someplace indoors, where the night couldn't creep in through the windows. We finally found it. A run-down motel sitting on the edge of the desert. It was one of those places that barely looked operational, with a flickering neon sign that simply read Desert Inn. The kind of place you'd pass 100 times without ever thinking to stop. But at that moment, it felt like salvation. I don't know if it was exhaustion or just desperation, but the sight of it pulled us in. It was nearly 2 a.m. when we pulled into the gravel lot, the only car there. Tim parked under the dim glow of a single street lamp, its light buzzing with the crackle of dying electricity. The office was an old trailer, its windows covered with dirty blind, and a small handwritten sign on the door read, "Office open 24-hour. Looks like we found our home for the night," Tim muttered, his voice heavy with fatigue. "Yeah, lucky us," I replied, trying to suppress the unease growing in my stomach. The old man at the desk didn't say much. He barely looked up from his crossword puzzle when we walked in, just slid a rusty key across the counter toward us. "Room 6, he mumbled. His voice sounded like sandpaper, dry and rough, as if it hadn't been used in a while. "Don't go wandering around at night. People get lost," I forced a laugh. "Lost? Where would we go? There's nothing around for miles." He didn't answer, just gave us this look, one that sent a chill down my spine. I grabbed the key and nodded at Tim, who seemed too tired to care. We shuffled out, back into the night air that was surprisingly cold for a desert. Room 6 was at the far end of the row of doors, isolated from the rest of the motel. The number on the door was half-hanging, as if someone had tried to rip it off but gave up halfway. Tim was already fumbling with the key before I could say anything. Inside, the room was, well, exactly what you'd expect. Cheap furniture, the stained carpet, and a bed that looked like it hadn't been touched in weeks. But it didn't matter. All we wanted was to crash for the night and get back on the road as soon as possible. But something was off. It wasn't just the run-down look of the place. It was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the oppressive kind, the kind that presses in on you, reminding you just how far you are from anything or anyone. We dropped our bags and collapsed on the beds, the springs groaning under our weight. I stared at the ceiling, trying to shake the feeling that had been gnawing at me since we left the highway. Tim was already half asleep, his breath slow and even, but I couldn't sleep. There was something about this place, and I don't know what it was, but I felt like we weren't alone. Have you ever stayed at a motel that gave you the creeps? One of those places that felt just a little too empty, a little too quiet. Tell me about it in the comments. Sometime after 3 a.m., I heard it. A knock. Soft at first, then louder. Tim didn't stir, but I was wide awake now. "Tim?" I whispered. But no response. I sat up, listening. It wasn't coming from our door. It was from the hallway. I got up, moving as quietly as possible, and cracked the door open. The hallway was empty. Just the dim, flickering light from the lone bulb above us. But the sound continued, knocking, faint, like it was coming from somewhere deeper inside the motel. Against my better judgment, I stepped out. The hallway stretched longer than I remembered, the far end lost in shadows. I swear it hadn't been that long when we checked in. As I walked, the sound of knocking grew louder, like it was echoing through the walls. But something wasn't right. There were too many doors. I counted 7 before I stopped. There had only been 6 rooms. I stood there, heart pounding, staring at the extra door at the end of the hall. It looked older than the others. The wood splintered. The number faded. The knocking was coming from behind it. I backed away, every instinct screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't take my eyes off that door. And then, just as I turned to go back to our room, the knob started to turn. I bolted back to room 6, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I locked it. Tim stirred but didn't wake, mumbling something incoherent in his sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to catch my breath. Then the knocking started again. This time it was coming from our door. I froze, staring at the door, my mind racing. It was a slow, deliberate knock. Whoever, whatever was out there wanted to come in. I looked at Tim, still out cold. It was just me. The knocking stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then I heard the sound of footsteps. Soft, shuffling footsteps moving down the hall, growing fainter and fainter until they disappeared. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually exhaustion won out. I lay back down, eyes heavy, forcing myself to believe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I drifted off to sleep, hoping the morning would come soon. I woke up to the sound of a woman crying. It was faint, barely more than a whisper at first, but as I became more alert, it grew louder. Someone was sobbing. I looked over at Tim. He was still asleep, completely unaware of the sound that was filling the room. I got up and pressed my ear against the wall. The crying was coming from the next room, room 7. But there was no room 7. I stepped outside, the cold air hitting me like a slap to the face. The hallway was shorter now, back to its normal length. The door at the end was gone, replaced by a blank stretch of wall. I stood there, confused, until I heard it again, the crying. This time, it was right behind me. I turned, and there she was, a woman, standing in the middle of the hallway, her face hidden behind long, tangled hair. Her clothes were torn, her skin pale and bruised, as if she'd been wandering the desert for days. She looked up at me, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Her eyes were wide, hollow, like 2 black pits staring straight into me. Before I could move, she turned and walked through the door of room 7. The door that wasn't there. We left the desert inn at dawn, neither of us saying a word about the night before. As we pulled out of the lot, I glanced back at the motel, expecting to see the old building fading into the horizon. But it wasn't there. The desert inn was gone, replaced by an empty lot, just dirt and gravel. No sign of the trailer, no flickering neon sign. Nothing. Like it had never existed. Tim didn't say a word. He just kept driving, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. And we didn't speak of it again. But I know what I saw. Have you ever stayed somewhere that seemed to vanish when you returned? Or a place that didn't feel real? Share your experiences in the comments. Some roads take you far away, but others, they take you somewhere you were never meant to go. It's strange how you can leave a place behind. But some roads take part of you with them, leaving you more lost than when you began. I thought after that night at the desert inn we'd be safe. That getting back on the road meant leaving whatever eerie things were out there in the desert behind. But there's something about long stretches of highway that makes you forget how quickly things can go wrong. Maybe it was the exhaustion, maybe it was desperation, but by late afternoon, Tim and I were back to searching for a faster route. It was around 5 p.m. when we decided to take the shortcut. We were driving through southern Arizona, somewhere near Benson, with the sun setting in the distance, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Our GPS had been spotty for the past hour, but it picked up again long enough to show an alternate route, a road that looked like it would shave off at least 2 hours from our drive. "Do we trust it?" Tim asked, his fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. I shrugged. Why not? We haven't seen a gas station or rest stop for miles. Might as well try something new. The shortcut led us off the main highway and onto a narrow 2-lane road. At first it seemed like a good decision. There were fewer cars and the desert was quiet, almost serene. But after an hour of driving, the pavement began to crack, the lines on the road fading until there were none at all. We were driving deeper into the middle of nowhere. Have you ever taken a shortcut that ended up being a terrible decision? Let me know in the comments. Did you regret it like I did? It was dark now, the last of the sun swallowed by the horizon. Tim flipped on the high beams, and that's when we saw it. Up ahead, barely visible, a tunnel carved into the side of a rocky hill. It seemed out of place, too modern to belong in such an isolated part of the desert. There was no sign indicating where the tunnel led, and the GPS had gone silent again. No service. Tim slowed the car, the tires crunching on the rough asphalt. "You think we should go through?" Tim asked, his voice unusually hesitant. I stared at the dark mouth of the tunnel. Something about it felt wrong. There were no lights, no signs of life, not even graffiti. Just an empty, yawning void that seemed to swallow everything around it. "We don't have much choice, do we?" I replied, trying to sound braver than I felt. The car crept forward and the tunnel enveloped us. As we drove deeper, the walls seemed to close in. The headlights only reached a few feet ahead, revealing slick, wet stone. Water dripped from somewhere above, echoing through the space. The temperature dropped sharply, a cold that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Tim, are you sure this is safe?" I asked, my voice shaky. Before he could answer, the engine sputtered and the car jerked to a stop. The headlights flickered, then went out completely. We were plunged into absolute darkness. "Great," Tim muttered, trying the ignition again. Nothing. Not even the faint click of the starter. I pulled out my phone to use the flashlight, but the screen stayed black. "You've got to be kidding me," I whispered, tapping the screen over and over. Dead. Tim's phone was the same. No signal, no power, nothing. We sat there in the dark for what felt like hours. The only sound, the occasional drip of water hitting the stone floor of the tunnel. The air was thick, stale, as if the tunnel had been sealed for years. "We need to get out of here," Tim finally said. "Maybe there's an emergency phone or something further ahead." I wasn't sure if I wanted to leave the car, but staying there in the pitch-black silence wasn't an option either. We grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment. Thank God for old-fashioned tech, and stepped out of the car. The light from the flashlight barely penetrated the darkness. The tunnel stretched on forever, the walls slick with moisture, the ground uneven under our feet. I kept close to Tim, every sound amplified by the oppressive silence around us. "Why is it so wet?" I asked, my voice echoing strangely in the tunnel. Tim didn't answer. He was focused on the path ahead, the beam of light shaking slightly as his hand trembled. I couldn't blame him. Something about this place felt wrong, like we were walking into the mouth of something alive. Then I heard it, a sound from behind us. Footsteps. "Tim, did you hear that?" He stopped, turning to look at me. "Hear what?" I held my breath, straining to listen. For a moment, there was nothing but the distant dripping of water. Then, clear as day, the sound of footsteps echoed through the tunnel, coming closer. They weren't ours. Tim's eyes widened. "Run!" We bolted, the flashlight bouncing wildly as we sprinted through the tunnel. The footsteps behind us quickened, gaining on us with every step. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The tunnel seemed endless, stretching on and on with no sign of an exit. "Where's the end?" I screamed, my voice barely audible over the sound of our pounding feet. But there was no end, just more darkness. Have you ever heard footsteps where no one should have been there? What did you do? Run like we did, or stay and see who or what was following? Let me know in the comments. Just when I thought we couldn't run anymore, the tunnel opened up. We stumbled out, gasping for air, into a wide, open space. The road continued, but something was wrong. Very wrong. There was no sky, no stars, and just an impenetrable blackness that stretched in every direction. The road beneath us seemed to shimmer, like it wasn't entirely solid, like we were standing on the edge of reality itself. Tim shone the flashlight around, but the beam was swallowed by the darkness. There was nothing here. No landscape, no horizon, just the road floating in a void. "What the hell is this place?" Tim whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we couldn't stay. We needed to find our way back to the tunnel, back to the world we'd left behind. But when we turned around, the entrance was gone. The tunnel had disappeared, leaving us stranded on this impossible road. I don't understand, Tim muttered, spinning in circles, the light flickering. Where did it go? How do we get out of here? I didn't know. There was no explanation, no logic. We were stuck, trapped in some nightmare that didn't obey the rules of reality. Then from the darkness we heard it again. The footsteps. They were closer this time, heavy, deliberate, coming from all directions, echoing off the invisible walls of the void. Tim and I stood frozen, backs to each other, the flashlight flickering in his hand. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking with fear. No answer, just the steady, unrelenting sound of footsteps growing nearer. The road beneath us trembled. I looked down and saw cracks forming in the asphalt, spreading out in jagged lines like a spider's web. The ground was coming apart, crumbling beneath our feet. "We have to move!" I shouted, grabbing Tim's arm and pulling him forward. But there was nowhere to go. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, the black void swallowing everything around us. The footsteps were deafening now, pounding in my ears and filling the empty space with their relentless rhythm. I could feel them closing in, surrounding us, though I still couldn't see anything in the darkness. Tim yanked his arm free, spinning around wildly. "There's nothing here. There's nothing." He stopped mid-sentence, his face going pale. His eyes fixed on something just beyond the beam of the flashlight. What is that?" I turned, following his gaze. In the distance, barely visible through the flickering light, was a figure. Tall, shadowy, and completely still, watching us. And then, without warning, the light went out. Alone on that forgotten road, with the footsteps drawing closer, and nowhere left to run. So what would you have done in our situation? Would you have turned back sooner? Have you ever found yourself in a place that seemed to defy explanation like we did? Tell me your stories in the comments. And don't forget, this isn't over yet. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more chilling tales, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what's coming next.